This is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. Today, we will introduce to you one of the most prominent and famous composers of our time, uh, and also and easily the most famous of all women film score composers of our time. Her name is Deborah Lurie. And I'm so honored to speak with her today. It's going to be very exciting. So you might ask, okay, why are you doing this? Well, it so happens that there is a COVID connection here. Now, let's just go back to those dark days of March 2020. Um, for the better part of starting then, and for the better part of 2 years following, among the most hard hit from the COVID lockdowns and oppressive regime under which we lived was the artistic community. That includes films. You recall your local theater was entirely closed because, of course, going to the movies gives you COVID, and we can't have that. But a lot of people don't realize just how harmed the artistic community was in particular. I remember going to a symphony about 2 years later, and the orchestra, before the concert was out, um, protesting. And not protesting, it was a labor union thing. But what they were doing was talking to audience members and saying, we could really use your support. Now, if you know me, I'm not exactly the first person to, say, yay, go unions. That's not my thing. But I was curious, and I just talked to the lead trumpet player for the symphony. I said, why are you doing this? And he said, well, it all comes down to the COVID lockdowns. They shut down the symphony. And none of us in the orchestra were paid by the rehearsal, paid by the gig, paid by the concert. They were all closed. So we had no source of income. We had to cobble together our own private studios, teaching lessons, uh, teaching kids who thought they were supposed to be wearing masks. We slipped into virtual poverty. So a lot of people just left the music industry, during which time the management continued to get paid. They continued to show up to work or work from home and got the same salaries and never felt it at all. And as from the point of view of the workers, namely the people, the talent, the people who make the music, we think this is unfair. Well, I'm listening to this thinking, this is a revelation. I'm deeply sympathetic. In fact, I gave them a donation because I thought it was exactly right. I mean, this is horrible. There was very little attention paid to what happened to the artistic community. I'm going to say it was March 12th, and I was in the city of Manhattan and settled up to a bar, and there were all these people there sitting there. I said, what are you doing here? And they said, well, Broadway has been closed. Of course, I had showed up for a Broadway production of some sort, and which was canceled that very day. And I said, I can't believe it. The entire thing was canceled. Yeah, sure enough, it was canceled just arbitrarily. I had a ticket to a show that night and to the next day, all three of which were canceled. And I said, what do you do for these? And they said, well, we work on lighting and sound production. And we were sent home. So yeah, we're completely unemployed. Fortunately, it's just for 15 days. That didn't happen. I think about that scene a lot because nobody cares about these people. They were put out of work completely for an arbitrary reason, for a virus that everybody already knew was mainly affected the infirm and elderly. But there was a central plan afoot, and we were only going to do essential things and not frivolous things like listen to music or go to shows. And this lasted for the better part of 2 years. Every concert hall in America closed. I consider that an outrageous betrayal of audiences and talent that this happened. And there's been absolutely no talk about it, no justice, no compensation, no coming to terms with what an outrage this is. There's a music festival, a very famous one in Massachusetts called, Deborah will remember the name of it. It's the summer home of the Boston City Orchestra. It shut down. Tanglewood. It's Tanglewood. It shut down for that season, the next and the next and next. Listen, friends, It's an outdoor theater. I mean, outdoors. They shut that down, betraying all their donors, the supporters, musicians, talents, everybody. And then when things started up again, you almost couldn't go to concerts unless you had taken the COVID shot. All the concert venues mandated that the only people that you had to show proof of vaccination even to get in. And if you, as a performer, disagreed with that, you couldn't get a ticket company to sell your tickets or a venue to book you. So that's how terrible it was. So, well, let's kind of migrate this little discussion into our next guest. Deborah Lurie, I think, fell victim to this scheme and objected to it. And I suspect it had an effect on her career, although I don't know the details. That's what we're going to find out today. But before introducing her, I'd like to just establish her cred here for a moment. Now, it's going to require that I look this up. We're going to play for you in a little bit one of her earliest compositions from a film for which she composed the music called An Unfinished Life. But I want to march through some of these others that you can look it up on IMDb. Safe Haven, Dear John, Captain Marvel, Just Add Magic, SpongeBob movie, Annie. She's the orchestrator for Annie. Much Ado About Nothing, the score producer. Katy Perry's Part of Me. She was a performer of the music score. The Dictator, Men in Black. She was an additional arranger. Alice in Wonderland, I may have already said that. Hellboy, The Golden Army. There's just so many. There's dozens. Spider-Man 3. Charlotte's Web, music arranger. Composer for Deep Sea, did additional music. Mozart and the Well, she was the orchestrator. An Unfinished Life, we're going to hear that. Charlie and Chocolate Factory wrote some of the additional music on that. So much beautiful music. And I've listened to some of them, and I've been so deeply touched by her sophistication and understanding the connection between sound and emotion. And she knows how to tie the two together in very subtle ways that remind me of some of the great composers. So let's listen just briefly to An Unfinished Life, and then I'll introduce Deborah.
You think the dead really care about our lives?
Yeah, I think they do. I think they forgive us our sins. I even think it's easy for them.
Griff said you had a dream about flying.
Yeah. I got so high, Heiner, I could see where the blue turns to black. From up there, you could see all there is. And it looked like there was a reason for everything.
Okay, so wonderful. I introduced you, Deborah Lurie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, I hope you liked my introduction to you.
Yeah, it was great. I have to. One thing I did not work on Captain Marvel, so that was a surprising addition.
Oh, really?
IMDb does some creative writing sometimes,
I see.
but I did appreciate the rest of it.
But uncredited orchestrator for the X Files, I see. Is that
Oh
true?
yes, yes, that was the beginning.
Really? Well,
Yes.
how does it? Gosh, so many questions. Uncredited, I don't like that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know that you want to tell your COVID story yet, but um, I'm very curious about. Here's something I don't understand. I'll put it this way. Um, so I was in music school. My brother's a professor of music, got his PhD in composition, I think. So I come from a very musical family, but a conventional musical family. I mean, I was a choral conductor. I played jazz trombone,
Oh wow.
e- even toured with Guy Lombardo Orchestra. I don't know if you've ever heard that name, but
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's a little bit insane,
Wow.
right? So I know this stuff pretty well, but you are not. It's not. It's a different industry, right? This is not just normal music education. There's something that's special and different about composing for films, right?
Yeah. From my perspective, I think of I always sort of thought of myself as more of I guess sort of a dramatist or a creative collaborator, and it was like music was my language, it was my contribution, but it was um, I didn't have a huge relationship with the concert hall because I grew up as a theater kid and I grew up dancing and everything. The different sensory experiences were so mixed and interdependent from the get go that it was all about drama and storytelling for me. And I mean, as obsessed as I was with music theory and structure and all of that as well, but from a professional standpoint, and what got me into movies, it was entirely narrative and storytelling.
Yeah. So you have to. There's a bit of an ego burying here. Burying, is that the way you said here? Because like when Beethoven or Brahms or Mahler sets out to compose a symphony, it's all about themselves and what's in their head, right? But, but you have to watch the film and say, okay, what am I hearing as I look at these pictures?
Yeah, it was, I mean, to call it collaborative is sort of an understatement. It can almost, and as I've taken a big step away from it, I can sort of see the idea that, in some ways I was here to enhance somebody else's story, and it has a completely different ego relationship. Not to say that there aren't uh, film composers with very healthy egos, but yeah, it is. It's so collaborative, and it's so it requires sort of um, a sense of empathy, an ability, an empathetic experience to understand a director's vision and a writer's story, and so it's not just what do I have to express to the world, and in fact that does get difficult. I would say, like when you get, having gotten to the middle of my life, there was a little bit of a wow, I can write in any style, I can be anything you need me to be. I'm sure that actors have that same sort of crisis when they sort of realize I can be anything you want me to be, but who am I, and some film composers have, get into concert writing in the middle, often after a lot of success, um, my I worked a lot with Danny Elfman, who's a big composer, and he
Yeah.
wrote a lot of concert works, like, you know, in the past 10 years, after huge success.
So moving from film to concert, and this is a little bit of a reversal because the early part of the 20th century, I'm going to say in the 1930s, there seemed to be a perception that the future of concert music is going to be with film. So you had some serious composers getting, writing for Hollywood stuff. So I don't know, people don't know this, but Leonard Bernstein did the score to On the Waterfront, right?
Yeah. And
Um,
Korngold was pretty serious, and maybe Bernard
yeah,
Herrmann.
yeah.
I'm not as a historian, but I also, I think, yeah, some of it was a creative fascination. Some of it may have been, where the work was.
Right.
I'm not super strong with history,
Well,
so
as I think about it, though, I'm thinking about it like so often. I think we think of music as the concert hall, but actually, um, um, the great opera tradition that matured so heavily in the 19th century was was basically the same thing that you've done, right? I mean, so
yeah,
Verdi and Puccini and Rossini and Mozart, they were deferential to a story, to a drama taking place on a stage.
yeah. I mean, it that was absolutely why I was there, and I have this very multisensory my way of perceiving the senses is a little bit unusual. So things are so mixed together, to focus just on music outside of storytelling or I could even teach. Maybe I'll do this in the future or something, but to teach literally a music theory class about how drama, from a very like technical, like non-emotional, almost algorithmic standpoint, sort of like when you hear this emotion, or when we want to be heroic, when we want to be devastated, when we want to be, sneaking around, like what tools are we using, and there's and a lot of composers try to be sort of mystical and keep the magic going, to just sort of say, oh, it just flows through me, and just kind of bypass all the technicality. But I'm not really like that. I'm more of somebody who likes to demystify the systems and to say it's not to bypass the creativity and the inspiration, but there's also a lot to it, from a sort of
And it makes
toolkit
such a
perspective.
difference. It's the entire soundscape, which is profoundly impactful on one's experience, right, of going to the movie. So if you go to a restaurant and you walk in and there's music like, "Unks, unks, unks, unks," you have a certain expectation about what's going to happen there. Whereas if it's a Schubert piano quintet or something, you have a different expectation and you behave differently. Um, and you can't have a birthday. What birthday party has ever taken place without somebody singing "Happy Birthday"? Right, that is the experience. Right?
Well,
So,
I mean, the truth of the matter is that I mean, there was a record store that where the motto was something like "Life is what happens when you're listening to music" or something like that. To like that. Basically, real life is scored. People think of and we can also get into like propaganda and absolute manipulation. There's a huge spectrum, but like basically the music that sort of scores our lives is hugely influential. you know and actually, when I was little, when I started becoming interested in being a film composer, I didn't even know what that was. I was more of a theater person, and but I started sort of realizing that there was this interface between music and drama. And I told my parents that it wasn't so much movies I wanted to do. I wanted to score real life. So basically, I decided, I sort of conceived of this business where, like, if some husband and wife were about to have some blowout confessional fight or something, they'd hire me and I'd come over with my keyboard, be like, okay, go for it, and I would sort of live score, improvise it. And so it was like kind of dark, but my parents were sort of supportive of my weirdness. And so I was always, it wasn't about this, film is a beautiful art form, but it was very fluid for me as far as like scoring drama.
Let's talk about two features of your personality that are a little bit unusual. I would like to sort of discuss this briefly. The first one is that you have perfect pitch, which, just so that people understand what that means, this is not relative pitch. Relative pitch means that I can sing a note and have a sense of what it is. But based on how it feels, maybe I have a little bit of a memory of it or something like that. And you can acquire relative pitch through training. But there's a different thing called perfect pitch, which is that the pitch is burned into your brain. You know exactly what it is. And I don't think that can be taught. I think it's just something that happens to you. And it's not always welcome. I once knew a harpsichordist with perfect pitch, and she could not go to concerts because she said the intonation drove her crazy, that everything seemed out of tune to her.
Yeah. And I think people are sort of tuned into different things. I don't think I've been more sensitive to micro tuning than another good musician, I would say, because, good musicianship without perfect pitch also has like extreme sensitivities. And so I also grew up around rock and informal singing. It was a very unrefined kind of upbringing. And so I don't have this sort of micro precision taste, I guess you could say.
You're not that scrupulous, huh?
Yeah. So my, I will tell you later, when we get into other topics about extreme sensitivities that are a little bit less conventional. But
well, perfect pitch is not conventional. It's actually quite rare. You will find it in most music schools. There are a handful of people that have it.
I would say the thing that is particularly unusual, I mean, it's not unheard of, but I have synesthesia.
That's the second topic I want to bring up.
Yeah.
It's called synesthesia, and this means that you hear sounds as colors. It's real. It's rare, extremely rare. It's a gift or a neurological malady. I don't know what you wanted to call it, but
you decide, everybody.
It's so that an A is green, but whatever. I mean, and it's on a full spectrum. So when you hear music, you hear the colors. There's a very famous organist named what's his name? Olivier Messiaen, who had synesthesia, and his compositions were actually paintings. We don't hear them that way. Although I would say that clip that we just played, I think that the text that's in the thing is referencing colors, and if you listen carefully, you will hear those colors in the music behind it. So I think your synesthesia has benefited you in some way to make more profound music. Do you think?
Yeah. Well, my way of, it's just my entire way of perceiving, perceiving what I hear. It's just completely involuntarily two fused sensory experiences. So I know that I'm hearing a C because I see red when a C is played, and I know that I'm hearing a G because I see blue when it is played. And so my I had this very dramatic kind of shift when I learned formal music theory in high school, and basically I was convinced that I was not particularly academic. I'm one of these people where I'm either you think I'm either sort of a savant or you think I'm Forrest Gump, and it sort of depends on the context, I guess. And so I really wasn't sure. And when I started taking this class at my public high school, which was very fortunate, I realized that this academic course that we were learning, I had known this stuff since I was 2 years old, but by color relationship. So I had learned to play piano. I started playing piano when I was 2, and I could mimic anything that I heard, but I wasn't taking lessons until I was a little bit older. But I was just sort of figuring it out, and I learned music, and I was always accompanying people. My sister was really into musical theater, and I would accompany her, and just to mess with her, I would put things in terrible keys just to make it really awkward and all of this stuff. And so I knew, and I was always playing in orchestra pits and playing Christmas parties, even though I just knew the Christmas carols from TV, even though I grew up in a Jewish family.
But you could render them because is this correct that you hear the music as a color spectrum? And so then you take a mental picture of it and you can reproduce that spectrum based on the notes you play. Am I getting this correct?
Yeah. So it's not just color, it's also structure, like the structure of tonal harmony. And so basically there are different relationships. So if I transpose the same piece of music into a different key, you just change the color and change the color relationships, And so when I learned this academic subject when I was 17, I was oh my goodness, I couldn't believe that this was this sort of brainy academic subject. And, it actually turned me from a very anxious, not necessarily good student to a straight A. Suddenly I could take any class in anything. And I went up to college and aced everything because it was this. It's hard to explain, but it's the structure of one thing sort of applies to the structure of another. It's certain. I call it my Helen Keller water moment. I don't know if you're familiar with The End of the Miracle Worker.
No, I should watch it again. It's been years.
Oh my gosh, yeah. It's she learns sign language. She's blind and deaf, and she learns by feeling her teacher's hands while she signs, and she was this mimic, she could sign. She learned just the entire dictionary or whatever in sign language, but she didn't know what it meant. She was just kind of a wild child. And at the end of The Miracle Worker, there's a scene when they're at a well, and they're pumping the water, and suddenly she realizes that the sign for water that her teacher is doing pertains to the water, and suddenly the music swells, and she's so excited, and she realizes, I know this entire language, because she was such a mimic, but now she knows what it means. Does that make sense?
This is due to the way in which sensory deprivation in one area will intensify things in other areas. But you're unusual in the sense that you don't have any sensory deprivation, but you have these extra gifts that allow the senses to hearing connects with mental images of colors, and patterns are revealed to you through what's audible becomes visual.
Yes, and yeah, it's become in recent years even more elaborate. So that gets into, I don't know if, I don't know if you want to
Well,
go here, but a
well,
lot of when
I'm
it
glad to
came,
go anywhere. I have to say that I've just never met anybody who had these gifts, and it's remarkable. It's remarkable to hear your stories. That it was just such a natural thing. Let me ask you something else. Now, at what point did you realize that your fellow musician friends did not have the same uh, issue, problem, talent, gift?
that is the most important question. So I really appreciate that you asked it because it'll be relevant to a lot of things I think we'll talk about, which is to realize when you realize that you're perceiving the world in a way that people around you are not, that can be the shock of your life because none of us, no matter how we're wired, we don't know what anybody else is perceiving exactly. Like if we're all excited when somebody says ice cream, or we're all like, not as excited if somebody says broccoli. I don't know. It's just like we don't really know what people are. And so yeah, with the synesthesia thing, it was in my high school choir. I remember it was one of the challenges. This was a challenge is that we were all pretty good sight readers, but we sometimes the director would actually transpose things just to have us sing it in a different key without telling us because it didn't matter to anybody else. But suddenly I was sight reading and transposing at the same time, and I was having a really difficult time, and I was like, I said something like he changed it from orange to dark blue or something like that, and the girl next to me was like, what are you talking about? And so that's when I started realizing, I mean, I didn't know that I had perfect pitch. My parents knew since I was like 2, but it's
So wait
all,
a minute, Deborah. I don't want to interrupt you, but so the reason this was a challenge for you is because you had to do a double transposition.
yeah,
So if it's in the key of A and she bumps it up a whole step to test your range or whatever, now you're having to transpose notes that you hear when you see them on page. You hear them as a precise thing. You're transposing them up a whole step. And you see the note as a particular color and having to transpose that too.
I guess it's 2 things, plenty of musicians can do this. I mean, the studio musicians in LA can just transpose, like can do crazy stuff. So I don't want to seem super special for like sight transposing because people can do that. But yeah, maybe they don't have the color ordeal at the same time. So yeah. So
you said, wait, this now the piece went from blue to orange, and your friend said, what?
yeah,
What could you possibly mean by that? Well, don't you see it?
yeah. And it was interesting. Yeah, the choir director was trying to turn our sound darker. Like there are sort of dark, like bright sounds, like little girls singing and then he wanted us to sound like these more adult choirs, and I was like, that's so clever because he turned it from this like fiery key up a half step into this dark, like blackish indigo. And I was like, that's so beautiful. That's so amazing how he got us to sing dark and by changing the color. And she was like, I don't know what you're talking about. So,
Now you've got me really curious. I'm going to ask you a quick question. If you think it's dumb, just tell me. What color is D in the Dorian mode, or D minor?
well, D is green, and F, so the minor third, whether it's Dorian or D minor, is like a brown. So it's like it's very foresty,
Okay.
because it's like
Yeah.
green.
I believe
Yeah.
you. I
Yeah.
believe you.
Um,
The Dies Irae is usually sung in D Dorian. So
yeah. Yeah. I mean, some of it's weird, like E is pink, and I hear all these guys playing the blues, in pink, and I'm like, so it's not always like sort of cinematically rational.
Well, Deborah, is synesthesia always the results of synesthesia, like you're stating, like what you perceive to be the truth? Is that entirely subjective, or do you, or is it true? I'm not sure how.
I know what you mean.
Okay.
So from what I've gathered so far, like there's a Facebook group that showed up, I don't know, 15 years ago, with people with synesthesia talking, and they would tell them, yeah, and apparently people's colors are generally different. I spoke to one woman recently, and we have a few overlaps, and it's very interesting, like with the crystal bowls and how there's sort of this old, people who are into, I don't know where these like chakra colors come from, and all these kind of spiritual traditions. It's sort of interesting because the root and the fifth for me are the same as the colors that I see, but then the other notes are different. So for all intents,
the root and the fifth are the same color?
Oh, not the same color. Sorry. Like no. Like, have you ever seen? I don't even know if this is like a Vedic tradition. It's honestly just a rainbow thing, like the chakras that people talk about. Root chakra being red, and I don't know what I'm talking about here, but there are certain kind of spiritual systems that associate pitches with colors, and for me, the root note and the fifth note, in my subjective mind's eye, synchronizes with theirs, but the rest of the notes in that system,
I see,
do not. And I've been curious. I'm like, okay, those are lower, like more closer to the fundamental if you get into the overtone series. So does it get more subjective? I don't know. But for all intents and purposes, I think of the colors as being subjective. So basically, but the perfect pitch is not. So basically, if I hear a C and I see red, and so I know it's C, then like for me to learn as a kid, okay, everybody agrees that this is C, and nobody agrees that it's red. And so I had to learn, and this gets really into a lot of the modern, the political stuff and whatever, which is to separate the subjective from the objective, and to hold those relationships at the same time and say, okay, this is how I know what I know, and this is what's true to me, and then here's how it relates to the entire world. So basically, if I taught a class and I decided that my colors were totally profound and correct, like they would just
them to all the kids. Right.
They'd be, and actually I had a conversation with somebody not too long ago about something related to that. And I was like, well, you could teach the kids to think there's significance in this, but that would just be my will. That would just be my ego. I think it's subjective.
Are octaves the same color? So you say that C is red. Is every C red?
Yeah. It's, the middle C is the most profoundly, richly red, and they sort of and actually I don't want to do this will get into modern times, like my life now, which is that I haven't been around a musical instrument for a very long time.
Well,
and so
look,
I don't.
Deborah, you don't have to tell the story. I'm not going to put you through that. But I will just say that the lives of millions, if not billions, of people was profoundly disrupted by the COVID experience, and the stories are endless and painful. You are not alone. Okay, so whatever happened to you, you're hardly alone. I mean, Brownstone Institute specializes in this, and I'm personally convinced that the level of civilizational just pain that comes out of that period is unspeakable, literally unspeakable, in the sense that people just don't want to speak about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So, my sensory system is way less tuned right now to music, and is sort of tuned to basically what turned into what I would call a discernment system, that basically I was picking up on patterns that are related to tonal harmony, but have to do more with societal harmony, and that was kind of what what changed everything.
For sure, starting in March, the film industry basically shut down, right?
Yeah. No, I wasn't super involved actually at that point because I had a pretty serious medical thing happen in March of 2019, where it was had to do with pharmaceuticals going extremely wrong, and I had sort of a neurological, not sort of, I had a neurological collapse. It was some kind of a catatonia event, where my brain shut down, and it was very, very scary. And I actually left for a year to get well, and that was sort of when my understanding of all of these medications that I was on. Now I have like a much better understanding of, this is for me. I'm not talking about for anybody else, but when I guess I know I was, how things like SSRIs and stuff can work on somebody with people with certain types of neurodivergence and what it can do. And I had an incident, that was so serious that I was out for a year, and but I got very strong. I got much better, and my views on health started changing and stuff, and my habits and my practices and everything like that. But I got by 2020 I was ready to take over the world. So that
Ready to go, but then the lockdowns happened. There were no movies made between like March and the end of the year. I mean, there was that one movie, I don't know if you ever saw, called, nobody talks about it. It's I think a beautiful movie called Songbird, that was made very early on in the lockdown period, and it was about lockdowns, and
really.
reviews are terrible. Everybody said, "Oh, don't watch this movie." I think it's a really profound movie. It's
Oh,
the very
I'd like
first
to see
movie.
that.
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting. I don't understand why people don't watch it.
Yeah.
But it was the very first movie made right after lockdowns hit, and it was about lockdowns, and really terrifying. So yeah, maybe watch it and get back to me. Tell me what you think of it.
Yeah.
But during that entire year, it was very difficult. I think that even Tom Cruise was trying to make a Mission Impossible while social distancing, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the crazy things is that I had gotten rid of my TV in, I think, 2018, and what happened with lockdowns for me was that I had this idea to rent my house out and to get this apartment directly on the beach in Santa Monica, because I realized that this tourist trap, like this crowded place, with the Ferris wheel, the famous scene, was suddenly empty, because they locked all the parking lots, like you couldn't go there, right? But there was exceptions for residents. There was one building that was like right there on the sand. And so basically I was like, the Santa Monica Pier will be my private beach. So I rented my house out and lived there starting in the middle of 2020. And so, yeah, my knowledge of what was happening in the media or what was happening outside of my little world was quite limited. I had no, I was not tuned in politically. I'm a stereotype. I'm from Palo Alto, California, and I believed everything that everyone else believed. And it just, but when I started walking that beach and using my own eyes and starting to compare what I was seeing with what I wasn't seeing TV news, but I was reading things, and I started essentially picking up patterns just like I always did in music. And it just, that's when it was not March 2020, like you're talking about. Like so many people that I follow on X and everything, knew something was up from the beginning. But for me, I spent 45 years just in my little bubble, just getting to be in showbiz and thinking things worked kind of the way that we were told. And so there was just an enormous shock there.
And so moving into 2021, now suddenly you have the shot, you have the vaccine mandates. Everybody in the industry was more or less required to get them as a matter of, requirement. It was like a protocol. Did you move back into film composing in 2021?
Well, I thought about it, and I, the shot was the hard no for me. That was what did it. Everything else was sort of an observation, and it was sort of like it was like a theater production where things were just falling, like the set pieces were like my whole kind of perception was turning into funhouse mirrors, I guess. But the shots were, I got a doctor's waiver. These doctors, they would lose their license if they wrote too many of these waivers. So, with her career on the line, she wrote an exemption for me. But what I found was, I couldn't go to concerts. I definitely, I couldn't go to restaurants. I couldn't, when I moved back into my house, there was a coffee shop at the end of my street where I hung out, and I was allowed to go in and stand in line and buy coffee, but not allowed to sit. And, seasoned dissidents might have been like, oh, this is ridiculous, like that I can pay money, I can stand here, but I can't sit here, and all this kind of stuff. But for me, I had no experience as any sort of rebel. I was just and yeah, so I was shut out, and my friend was, I was always going to my friend's concerts, and this friend, he was like, oh, let me ask, my people, I'm sure I can get you in and stuff. And then he calls me back. He's like, nope, I can't, and as far as I knew, I couldn't get a haircut. I couldn't go to a yoga class. I couldn't do anything but not to mention go to a scoring session or any of that kind of thing, And, but the toughest thing though was that the people who were the most strict about it were my friends. I was no longer welcome, with, a lot of my inner circle, and, so things were, I had to process this on my own. I was just trying, I was not coming from, I had my own observations about what was going on, but I believe very much in autonomy, and I was only speaking for myself, and I just wanted to live, have the same rights as everybody else. And I did not, you know, uh, I wasn't getting COVID. I wasn't sick, I was, but I was trying to understand why I was considered a vector of disease, and I just had no reference for this. So like for 5 years now, I guess it's been 5 years, I've spent, I'm the kind of person that if I get sort of terrorized by anything, I've been like this my entire life. If something shocks and terrorizes me, I have to get to the bottom of it. I I don't drop it. I don't, and so I've just been really fascinated with what happened. And, I'm not on some crusade to call out any particular industry or any particular person or whatever. It's more of what makes a large portion of society suddenly develop a belief system that changes, that it basically takes some of its members and says, you can't be here anymore. You're done. You're out, Now, I will say, like, there was one company that wanted to hire me, like one of the major companies wanted me to score this show. And I didn't really want to do it. I hadn't worked, since the collapse the year before, and it wasn't a good show. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I was considering it, and they actually, so I actually was pretty bold, and I just said, I don't have the shots. And I said, I have a letter of exemption or whatever. And I think they were very uncomfortable. I mean, I don't want to throw, they basically were like, it's okay. It's okay. You can do the show. You can't use live musicians. Like, you can't be with, you have to deliver it electronically. You can't go to any of the mix sessions, like, basically, as long as you don't interact with a human. And so it wasn't some uniform law. So I wasn't one of these people crusading against the law. It was like, my reason for making music had to do with collaboration. It had to do with, like, there was a certain, I don't want to be cheesy, but it's, there's actually sort of a harmony, or like a harmonic logic to artists working together, and to say, you're going to be in an isolated chamber and not allowed to breathe the same air as other people. I didn't have it in me to make music under those conditions. And I haven't made music since, and I know that's very sad. At the same time, I do, I'm a resilient person. I'm learning a lot, and, I'm not going to stop until we figure this out as a society,
Yeah, well, we have to talk about it. So that's why it's so good you're doing this podcast. Was there ever a time in which because I went through this myself. I felt like the entire world was mad at me and screaming at me, and the TV was mad at me. Colleagues were mad at me. Everybody was mad at me, and I thought I felt like the weight of the world. Like, I felt like everything was collapsing in on me, and I could make it all go away just by driving down to the local drugstore and say, "Shoot me up with your potion."
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and I don't know, you know, um, I don't know really what your persona was before this, but the idea of becoming a bad person, especially for me as that had maybe a little bit of an exaggerated good girl Pollyanna vibe, that was, some of it may have been people pleasing, but honestly, I really did kind of think this was a friendly place, and
World's a good place, a happy
and
place of nice people, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
like like I really do think that there's sort of an initiation that a lot of us go through, like by becoming the villain in people's stories, and to see badness mirrored back to me by the people that I loved the most and I respected the most. Like to even have like old teachers and whatever just be like, oh, like I didn't have a lot of confrontation, but there's just no meeting of the minds here. It's it certainly makes you grow up, to just be like, yeah, to just know what it's like to just have people say, we don't want you here, like get out, um, and and then to go to a place I had never been. I live in Florida now. I had never been here. I didn't know a soul here, and I was such a, I just knew California. I knew San Francisco. I knew LA. I knew New York, Boston, London, and yeah, it's just been an entirely different education.
Are you able to watch movies now?
Not really, no. I've seen a few, but I'll tell you why. It's not. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of pain, a lot of grief, but what's happening in the world is so fascinating. It's sort of taken on a movie like style of its own, I guess. And so to see the mythology that is playing out and to make sense of that has been really interesting. So in a way, I've like plugged out of the movies and sort of into the kind of archetypal melodrama that is unfolding right now. And
okay, a trivial question. It's not trivial, but what are your favorite film scores aside from your own?
oh my goodness, oh, this is so hard.
Just you don't have to give a scientific list. Just
Yeah.
which ones stand out?
Well, I had a friend who used to tease me all the time, saying that I never listened to film music. I'm just the most like everyone else, like hanging out at John Williams concerts, and I was like never,
I know.
So like my own appreciation of the literature, so to speak, is limited. But well, first, there's, okay, I'll start with the more normal stuff, which is like, I mean, I've always loved Thomas Newman, like Shawshank Redemption and American Beauty are just, his understanding of deep, deep drama is just stunning to me. And his sound is also like a lot of what makes his sound the way that it is has to do with the musicians that play it, because there's a lot of sort of controlled improvisation, I guess, just a little like room for just slight, I don't know, organic motion. And I got to work with those musicians quite a bit, which was amazing.
What about as a little girl? Like,
so growing up is not going to help my Pollyanna thing at all, but Mary Poppins and The Wizard of Oz and The Sound of Music. I mean, that's why I do what I do is, you know, Willy Wonka, Charlotte's Web, the animated. You know, I worked on
You did work
on
on
the
Charlotte's Web.
I worked on the Dakota Fanning live action, but
Yeah.
I'm talking about the little like pencil, you know,
Yeah.
2D drawing one that you know, a lot of these things had songs by the Sherman Brothers, you know, who also did all the stuff for Disneyland. And I was on a panel with Richard Sherman at one time, which was just like amazing. And yeah, so like classic Disney.
And who's the guy who did his most famous score of Gladiator and now has a gigantic studio?
Oh, Hans Zimmer.
Hans Zimmer. Yeah. So, can you tell me something? You know, just between us and the rest of the world, is Hans Zimmer really compose all that music, or does he run a big studio? You know, like I'm thinking about the court composer under Louis the 14th was Lully. And a ton of the compositions attributed to Lully were actually his studio. He just languidly, you know, laid on a sofa eating grapes while all of his students composed music under his name. So is that Hans Zimmer, or is he actually, what's going on there?
Well, I'll tell you my perception from somebody who has not worked with him, but you know, I know the industry and I've worked with plenty of people and I've met him, you know, I've talked to him, and is that and I actually, well, this is the way I talk about every issue, which is that I would say he set more of like a paradigm, you know, for how things change. And so if he was sort of like the trailblazer of a new way of doing things, like, you know, he's certainly not alone. I would say sitting and eating grapes is not what he does. I think he's actually like I think he's an intensely hard worker, but I think he's running such a enormous empire that, you know, how is one person do, you know, so it's not about, is this person a fraud and they really have this person doing it. It's more about, and this is what's changed the whole film industry and arguably what's changed the entire world, which is, if you have an artistic thing going, how do you scale up exponentially? It's like, what's the difference between Amazon and your neighborhood bookstore? You know, it's about, you know, and so I was encouraged, like, you know, my way from like rising, you know, and being sort of this, from, you know, really having a very promising career to, I would say, struggling more, had to do a lot with my discomfort with becoming a brand as opposed to a human, you know, a human composer. And even just the work that I did, I had to get additional composers, just like I was an additional composer for other people. And it started out as something that like people would just need help because the deadlines were getting crazy, and like the change to digital from film basically meant that the edit could be changed forever. And so basically people could they could change the score every single day of post-production. And so you needed more and more people to keep up with the way things were done. And so ultimately, composers had to either decide to run a brand where they had like a stable of, you know, up and comers that would write in your style, you know. And I would say, you know, for me, the encouragement didn't take, you know, I was unwilling, and it wasn't like I had some big moral thing. It was just, I mean, you know, now that we're all contemplating the whole AI thing, like, and I'm like, oh yeah, like I've been watching this thing for 25 years in slow motion, like every little increment of it. So a lot of things nowadays that everybody's like suddenly, kind of facing this existential, crisis of machines are doing what the humans were doing. And I'm like, yeah,
You've seen that before.
I mean, I've been watching it happen slowly, you know what I mean? Like, just as the way that the film industry changed, from onto the streaming platforms and what all the synthesizers can do and everything, every aspect.
Oh, by the way, I sometimes romanticize the days of the synthesizer. What a great instrument, right? I mean, I think it's sort of gone now, right? I mean, the old fashioned analog synthesizer, whatever it was, it's a great sound.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned at the beginning the X-Files movie. That's how I got the way I got my first gig was like, because I didn't know anybody in the film industry and I was really shy. Like, how was I going to get a gig, But I actually got sort of recruited because Mark Snow, who scored the X-Files TV show, they were suddenly going to make a movie and there was going to be an 80-piece orchestra and he worked on this sort of the last of the kind of onboard synthesizers that weren't hooked up to computers. It was called a synclavier, and everything he did for the X-Files show was just this layered thing on this machine, and so they had to find somebody who could just take stereo tapes and transcribe these sort of washy improvisations for orchestra. And so, I was like, 22 years old or something, and just like sitting on my little sofa with giant score paper. This was like before everything was computerized, and just transcribing it.
I'm going to ask you the question I've always wanted to ask a composer. How did you learn the technical capabilities of every instrument enough to be able to score for them? I've never understood how anybody could do that.
Yeah, I mean, I did not have a lot of formal education. I only did an undergraduate, and I guess I talked a little bit about how that music theory class was such a huge deal, and I was already 17. Like, I didn't, I had this very dramatic story where I suddenly knew that I wanted to go off to music school, and I had already applied to colleges, and I had to like withdraw and like learn how. Basically, I had a teacher teach me how to make it look from a university perspective as if I had a background in theory and composition, which I did not. I crash coursed in like 2 months, and I sort of faked my way in. I could ace all the ear training classes, so there were certain, but I flew to USC and I said all the stuff that this guy this teacher told me to say, and they accepted me on the spot. Like, I just wowed them, and yeah, I was, so I just had 4 years of school, but and I was very good. Like, I had sort of like a little bit of I was really good in theory. I could just read the book the day of the test and just ace it and stuff. But I combined the film scoring program with my senior year. So I did it all. They don't let you do that anymore, but I, combined it all. Plus I was scoring all these student films and taking graduate courses, and my brain was just like exploding.
On fire. Yeah.
And, but in 4 years, you don't learn that much orchestration. I mean, we had 1 or 2 years of orchestration. And, so a lot of it is, sorry if my answers are a little.
No, it's fascinating.
Like, but a lot of it, like a lot of film composers are learning on the job, and when it comes, there are, um, depending on who the composer is, like, um, like their team with orchestrators and, even copyists and all these people who are doing the more formal kind of orchestra side of things, like, um, they can be more supportive, more, in my case, it wasn't that big of a deal. Like but well, it depends. I mean, if I was writing kind of outside of a genre, I might like bring in somebody who was an expert in that. But a lot of it is, I mean, I would have loved to stay in academia and just learn everything
Yeah,
there
no, I
was to
can
learn and
imagine.
be really good
But
at it.
at some
But you
point
just have
in
to
your
do
career,
it.
were you ever able to? Because I love, one of my favorite things to do is to go to the library and check out the score of a Mahler symphony or whatever, and put it on and follow the score along. But it's very different to following a score as versus, say, hold on, let me turn that off. I don't know. I have no luck. It's very different to follow a score along as versus actually hear it, like without the music and
Yeah.
just. So that's one thing I can't do is like, I look at a score and I think, okay, the violins are doing this, the oboe is doing that, the timpanis are doing that. How might that sound? But I suspect that you're different. You can look at a score and actually hear it.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do about that
Um,
sound. Louis is
oh
going
yeah,
to have
I've
to
got
turn that
device.
off for me.
Oh, oh, was that my
No, that's
device?
me.
I
It's I've
apologize.
got people
Okay.
texting me oh, I know what I can do. I can just turn off my notifications just like you did. Hold on. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, there we go. Do not disturb. So I
Yeah.
guess what I'm asking is like, so I'm guessing that you can look at a printed score from top to bottom and actually hear what's going on. Am I right?
Yeah. I mean, I would, there are probably people do who do that, more strongly than I do, because I was so multimedia. Like I was working as much in rock bands as I was in orchestra and all, so my time with scores and translating from paper scores to um, the orchestra and what I'm hearing, it's been a long time since I did that. So I don't, I probably, if you imagine Mozart or whatever, it's not just like interchangeable, like the written, especially because I was such an undisciplined musician as a kid. I was such a mimic. And I mean, I entered piano competitions and stuff like that, but I didn't know it. I didn't really structurally know what I was doing until that big revelation. But another thing I used to do when I first got started, like these different things that basically pull you out of obscurity into the business, just like drag by your hair, was when I started, people were still using pencil and paper. These were handwritten scores, and the copyists were writing every single part, and so there was a lot more human error. Nowadays, when things are orchestrated, anybody is actually playing back some simulation,
Yeah.
some sort of synthesized version of what they're doing.
Sure.
But
I mean,
back in the day,
even 20 years ago, I saw my brother. He would compose on the keyboard, and there'd be a screen that would render it in notes.
yeah.
What?
So basically, there's a huge. I mean, the amount of human error is just like pretty much gone at this point, right? And so, but back in the day, it was like how alert and also how bad was your handwriting? Like if you like these circles and stems and stuff, like if it's ambiguous, like so I used to get hired to sit in the booth and follow scores while the orchestra was playing and call out, so I would say, okay, horn number 3, I'm hearing an E flat and I see an E natural, and so I'm calling out wrong notes. And sometimes there would be entire passages with, let's say, an orchestrator with a little bad drinking habit, or like actual like massive errors, right, where a whole passage was just gobbledygook for some reason. And so I had a Sony Walkman, and like they would take these union 10-minute breaks, every 50 minutes, everything, with these orchestra sessions when the union was still strong, was very regimented down to the second, so the 10-minute break goes, I would run out to the lobby of the recording studio, often like leaning against a pool table or something, and just transcribe from the original demos the section that was messed up. And then I would go out to the orchestra and I would dictate every single note, like basically there's a space, now half note, now blah, blah, there was no other way to do it back then. You dictate the whole thing, and then the orchestra would play the passage. I did this, it's so funny. Every time I hear I don't want to out somebody, but it was a movie having to do with Halloween, the horror, the John Carpenter Halloween, and and after my dictation and transcription fix, like the whole thing played perfectly, and I was like, yes, so. I had all this stuff, when I was
Brilliant.
just like right out of college, and that was sort of my first.
That's just brilliant.
My first gig.
Deborah, here's a funny question, because I'm getting a sense of like the disruption that happened in your life. Do you have a keyboard?
I have a keyboard.
Okay.
Here, wait, you can't see my fingers, but it's got about like 12 notes. It's a little toy.
But no piano.
No piano.
Do you want a piano?
I'll get there. Thankfully, actually, my parents have my piano. I had a beautiful grand piano in my beautiful house, and it was, my parents moved to Massachusetts, and took it all the way from LA there, so it still exists.
Come for a visit. We'll make you a Supper Club speaker. That would be thrilling to have you. In Connecticut, if you come anywhere in New England, come anytime. You're welcome anytime. Now, there may be an opportunity to recruit you back into your profession with this film that we're sponsoring called The Rash by Walter Koenig. So, and the producer was probably interested in if we can get it funded.
Ms. Shanahan?
Well, I guess I'm using the wrong word. She's, I think, a producer, but I think maybe I'm speaking of the director.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Is interested in your work. So we might have to recruit you. So who knows, Deborah? Maybe all this stuff happens for a reason. Maybe you're the film composer for The Rash. We'll see. I would just be thrilled. Deborah, it means the world to me that you sat with me and told me your story. And it's been such a pleasure to meet you this way.
Thank you. This was such a treat for me. And I've loved your work for so long. This was really
I have this burning desire to send you. I have one piece of music I want to send you. But I know people do this to you all the time, and you probably just delete it. But I'm going to try to send you one piece of music, and it's from 1490, and it's by a composer named Josquin des Prez. And it's called Qui Habitat. And it's scored for, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it's scored for 12 separate voices. And the piece is written as a canon. And I find it one of the most extraordinary things I've ever heard in my life. And I'm going to send it to you. You can just look it up. Just write me back and tell me what color it is and what you see. If you can.
Here, wait. I want to write down. I love
Well,
Jazz Cambo.
well, it's called Qui
What's it
Habitat,
called?
which is a Latin from the Vulgate for one of the Psalms. But he wrote it, I think, at that period of time. Of course, this was a weird period of time, but in terms of the composition standards at that time, 1490, 12 individual parts would have been, highly unusual, I think. But
For 12 different parts?
yeah,
Wow.
voices, right? So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, the thing
Are
is,
you sure about that?
what? That it was unusual?
Or was it? Well,
No, I'm saying
yeah. Maybe it was like a double choir.
there are 12 different
Yeah.
voices in
Yeah.
this canon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
So I'm just going to send it to you, and I'm going to find out what you see if you flatter me and listen to the thing. Just tell me about the colors, because I think it's a
yeah.
mysterious piece of music. I don't even understand how a piece like that comes to be. 500 years ago. It's so weird to me. But
Yeah.
yeah,
That music is so
it's
beautiful. I just
beautiful, isn't it? That
love the
period, yes,
Renaissance music.
Renaissance, right, right.
Yeah.
Sort of late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, I guess.
Yeah.
Late 16th, late 15th, and early and 16th century. It's just such a period. Um, for that 100 years between 1490 and 1590, it's just like, what the hell happened?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Oh my gosh. It's incredible. I just love I grew up singing that kind of music
Did you
and I
really?
just love it.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you again, Deborah, and for gracing us with your presence today on Brownstone Show. All the best.
Thank you so much.